The news that Jim Jones might be facing life in prison is currently spreading like wildfire, leaving the hip-hop community in full amazement. Yes, the FBI has discovered fresh, incriminating evidence that might permanently end his legal woes, just when it appeared like they couldn't get much worse. As the entire extent of Jim Jones' alleged involvement in criminal acts finally comes to light, the music industry is preparing for the repercussions. Insiders are rushing and fans are left stunned. While some sources believe this is just a witch hunt, others say the evidence is so strong that even Jim's closest supporters are no longer able to defend him. Reports are pouring in. However, what precisely did the FBI discover? Is the Dipset legend's career and freedom truly coming to an end? Or is there an unexpected turn of events? The conjecture is out of control, and the streets are humming. What actually happened? And who else is involved? Above everything else, is Jim Jones going to lose everything? Get ready as we delve into the largest hip-hop scandal of the year. The unexpected news that Jim Jones had been caught in a large-scale FBI sting operation stunned the hip-hop community. However, this was no ordinary arrest. No, this was enormous. Jim Jones was dealing with more than a simple allegation or legal misunderstanding. The charges against him this time were serious enough that legal experts were already predicting that he would face life in jail. A string of raids in the early morning marked the beginning of it all. Federal officials reportedly stormed at least 3 locations associated with Jim Jones, including a residence where he was reportedly staying, according to multiple sources. Witnesses recounted a spectacular scene, complete with heavily armed officers, SUVs that were blacked out, and the obvious anxiety that arises when federal agents conduct a high-profile arrest. One witness, who lives close to the place where Jim was arrested, claimed that they were awakened by a loud knock on a door. The witness said, "I heard them yelling. They were directing someone inside to raise their hands and come out. It was intense." Jim Jones appeared stunned but calm as he was let out in handcuffs in a matter of minutes. But why was the actual question? What actions by Jim Jones were sufficient to justify such a risky arrest? Initially, there were rumors. Others conjectured that it was related to old instances finally catching up with him, while others said it was a misunderstanding. However, the truth was far more bizarre than anyone had anticipated when the first significant leaks began to surface. Insiders claimed that this bust was not an isolated incident. Jim Jones had been under FBI surveillance for years. According to reports, they had assembled a strong case using surveillance, wiretaps, and undercover agents. They had now at last taken action. However, what were the charges specifically? Things were much more startling at that point. Jim Jones was allegedly connected to a vast criminal enterprise that went well beyond music, according to many federal sources. Authorities thought they had evidence that connected him to illicit money laundering, drug trafficking, and other financial operations. However, it didn't end there. The FBI claims that Jim Jones was not only involved in criminal activities, but also played a significant role in it. Financial documents, videos, and even informants who had given thorough explanations of his involvement were purportedly in their possession. Then the greatest surprise of all was revealed: Jim's close friend had flipped. Yes, exactly. According to reports, Jim's longtime friend and business partner was arrested months ago on separate charges. This individual had allegedly struck a deal with federal authorities, facing severe prison time. They had also surrendered all of their knowledge regarding Jim Jones as part of that agreement. According to reports, the material they gave was so damaging that it validated the Fed's presumptions, and they didn't hesitate once they had the proof in order. The raid took place at that time. According to law enforcement officials, the operation was meticulously designed to make sure Jim Jones had no escape route. To seize evidence and save any important records or materials from being destroyed, the agents struck quickly, striking several places at once. Jim Jones wasn't the only person hauled in. Soon after, it was reported that several other people had also been taken into custody with him, raising the possibility that this was not a single incident, but rather a component of a much bigger federal probe. It prompted the horrifying inquiry right away: who else was involved? Because the feds couldn't possibly be stopping at Jim alone if they had spent years constructing this case. People began to question if other rappers were related. Were there going to be additional arrests? The most important question of all may be whether Jim Jones would speak or remain silent, because the pressure to strike a bargain becomes unbearable when someone faces life in prison. At that point, the situation became even more dire. Legal professionals say Jim Jones is facing serious allegations. Because they dislike losing cases, federal prosecutors give it their all when they pursue a target, and what they had in this instance was damning. Among the evidence, according to insiders, was surveillance film purportedly depicting Jim Jones interacting with important players in an underground organization. Conversations on financial transactions and other matters are recorded via wiretaps. Financial documents that connect him to offshore accounts and questionable payments. The situation becomes worse from here because Jim's past could work against him. Some of his prior affiliations could be used against him in court, despite the fact that he had avoided significant legal issues in recent years. Prosecutors may contend that this was a trend rather than an isolated error. Thus, Jim Jones may be facing a decades-long case that the government has been waiting for the right opportunity to crack down on him, rather than simply one charge. And that time had arrived. Authorities were now holding Jim Jones without bail, claiming that he posed a flight risk. That implied that he would be imprisoned until his trial unless something extraordinary occurred. Speaking of the trial, that's just another catastrophe waiting to happen, because Jim Jones and his legal team had an uphill battle with this level of proof. And the greatest enigma still stood: was this a setup, or was Jim actually involved? The business was already hearing rumors that Jim Jones was being unfairly singled out. Some others thought this was just another instance of the government attempting to discredit well-known black performers by claiming tenuous ties to illegal activity as a pretext for widespread takedowns. Others thought that the individual who switched on Jim was lying to protect themselves, and that Jim had been set up. However, a startling new discovery followed, because the FBI wasn't finished yet, according to sources. Rumor had it that additional arrests were on the horizon. It implied that there was more to come in this instance. The question that followed was, who else was going to be taken down if Jim Jones wasn't truly working alone? Jim Jones' thoughts was racing as he sat with his hands shackled to the table in the chilly, sterile FBI interrogation room. He had been going about his business as usual just hours before, totally oblivious to the fact that federal officials were getting closer. Right now, he was stuck in a bad dream. What's the worst? He wasn't the only target of the FBI. They were pursuing all those involved, because Jim wasn't working alone, based on reports that were released. When Jim's arrest first surfaced on social media, the majority of fans thought it was just another miscommunication, possibly a small one that could be resolved with the right attorney and contacts. However, when more information became available, it became evident that this was much larger than anyone had anticipated. This wasn't a simple traffic stop or a small legal matter. A full-scale federal operation was involved. For years, the FBI has been keeping an eye on everything. News organizations were rushing to get information within minutes. Hip Hop VX, The Shade Room, and TMZ all began investigating the case and contacting insiders for any hint as to what was actually happening. Then, the first significant leak appeared online. A senior law enforcement source claimed that Jim Jones had been captured on secret FBI recordings, not once or twice, but several times. Furthermore, they were not only informal discussions. These conversations were coded, conversations that implied Jim was fully aware of what was happening, and perhaps that he had been part of something much more significant than anyone had thought. The responses came immediately. Social media was inundated with fans discussing if Jim had indeed done what the FBI was alleging. Some people didn't think it was true. Others claimed that they had a constant suspicion that something was happening behind the scenes. The biggest surprise, though, was when sources began to imply that Jim wasn't the only one engaged. because the FBI was reportedly looking into more than just Jim Jones. They were looking into a whole network. The subsequent round of arrests started at that point. Rumors began to circulate that another prominent man had been detained within hours after Jim's detention. Initially, no one knew who. There was silence from the FBI. However, the rumors quickly spread. According to some, it was a fellow rapper. According to others, it was one of Jim's closest business associates. But what did everyone agree upon? There were others in trouble besides Jim. Another bombshell was released as the rumors spread, because this case was about more than simply money. According to recently revealed court documents, it was also about power, influence, and strong industry ties. The FBI had been listening in on private conversations, tracking movements, and following money traces. And now, they had every piece of proof they required. This was the worst thing that could have happened to Jim Jones, because things could quickly get out of hand if even one member of this network chose to work with the federal government. And that's precisely what took place next. Someone close to Jim had already begun speaking, according to individuals involved in the probe. The public was not given access to the name. However, behind the scenes, industry insiders knew exactly who it was. Jim, too. He sensed the deception right away, because snitching was the worst crime in the hip-hop world. And now he had been betrayed. Jim's legal team was rushing around at the same time. Damage control was already being handled by his attorney, who is among the best in the industry. In a statement, he asserted that Jim was innocent, that he was being set up, and that this was simply another instance of the system targeting a successful black guy. But what's the issue? There was a growing amount of evidence. In addition to wiretapping conversations, reports stated that the FBI had apparently intercepted emails, texts, and even video footage that purportedly connected Jim to high-level meetings with specific people who were the subject of the investigation. Then the greatest shock of all occurred. Jim's recent actions weren't the only thing the feds were considering. They were investigating his history. Things that people had assumed had been long forgotten, including historical instances and relationships, were unexpectedly brought back into the public eye. The term 9 Trey gangsters began to be used once more. People began to wonder if this had anything to do with the events from years past. Jim had already disassociated himself from that life, according to several fans. Some weren't so certain. Meanwhile, on the streets, people were discussing. Other rappers, industry experts, even former associates, everyone had an opinion. Some defended Jim by claiming that this was all a part of a bigger scheme to overthrow him. According to others, Jim had developed some enemies over the years, and perhaps, just possibly, someone had finally made the decision to turn him in as retaliation. Then someone else was arrested. This time, it was a direct associate of Jim's company. The press went into overdrive. News outlets began airing reports about a hip-hop conspiracy, about clandestine activities, and about a possible RICO case that may bring down Jim and a number of other prominent figures. There were a ton of theories on the internet. Who else did the FBI have its eye on? Was this the start? Was Jim going to end up like other rappers who have run afoul of the law? The situation became much more acute due to the uncertainty. However, Jim, he didn't say anything. No posts on social media, no remarks in public, no communication with anybody but his legal counsel. He was waiting, confined and alone, because the most important question was still whether he would resist this, or would he make a concession to get out of it. The worst was far from finished, regardless of what transpired next. Jim Jones was confronted with the most difficult reality of his life within the chilly confines of the federal detention facility. He had invested years in developing his career, earning millions, and establishing himself as one of the most reputable figures in hip-hop. Now, though, he was now just another prisoner in an orange jumpsuit, awaiting the outcome of his case. Time had slowed to a crawl within, while the outside world was moving quickly. It seemed like every second went on forever. There was new fear every minute, because he knew the truth in his heart, regardless of how tough he pretended to be and how much he convinced himself he could win this case. the FBI wasn't having any fun. They had a significant item, and this might be the end if he didn't move wisely. Jim had previously dealt with legal issues, but this time was different. There was a strong sensation that this time there was no way out of the repercussions, a sense of finality. Rumors, hypotheses, and conjecture continued to abound in the world beyond the prison walls. The media never stopped analyzing every little detail, and the fans, they were divided. Some believed he was guilty, while others supported him. But when the administration took the next step, the true nightmare started. Citing recently uncovered financial evidence and confidential witness testimony, federal prosecutors filed fresh accusations against Jim. Officials revealed during the explosive press conference that this case was about more than simply Jim. His entire business was being targeted. Now, it was a RICO case. For those who do not know, one of the most severe legal tools available to the government is a RICO, Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Indictment. Originally intended to overthrow drug cartels, mafia lords, and criminal empires now, it was being used against Jim Jones. The industry was rocked by the announcement. Everyone was aware that the conviction rate was extremely high after the FBI hit you with the RICO case. The majority didn't beat it. They actually flipped instead of resisting, and the FBI was depending on that very thing. Jim wasn't the only person taken into custody. Coordinated raids across several states resulted in the capture of several of his longtime allies. They were brought in for interrogation one by one. The feds only wanted one person to crack, not all of them to speak. Then it occurred, someone broke. Initially, there were only rumors, but soon there were claims that one of Jim's closest friends had consented to work with the government. This treachery was enormous. This was someone who had been with Jim for years, not some low-level someone attempting to save himself. Legal insiders claimed that the witness had given important information about coded messages, private meetings, and money transactions. Worse, the federal government had recordings. When leaked audio from an undercover informant surfaced, the internet went crazy. It was muffled and blurry, but distinct enough to identify the voices. Jim Jones was purportedly one of them. And the dialogue? It was damning. Jim was heard talking about something very suspect in the audio, coded words, ambiguous allusions, but it was sufficient for law enforcement. Every major news site reposted the video, social media users analyzed it, and fans all around the world debated it. It spread like wildfire. One thing was for sure, the harm had been done, regardless of whether it was a hoax or taken out of context. As the evidence accumulated, the case took a new turn. Jim wasn't the only target of the prosecution any longer. His entire business was being targeted. They sent out more subpoenas. They brought in more people to question, and cracks began to appear as the pressure increased. Individuals who had previously pledged allegiance to Jim began to turn away. Old buddies would not comment. People in the industry who had previously supported him began unfollowing him on social media. The case was then rocked by yet another huge twist. A concealed financial trail, a string of transactions purportedly connecting Jim to offshore accounts, covered investments, and potential money laundering, had been uncovered by the FBI. There was more to this than a single transaction, instance, or discussion. Years of transactions that were meticulously concealed up to this point. Jim's defense team refuted everything right away. They asserted that everything was a misunderstanding and that the government was fabricating evidence to implicate him. However, Jim was aware of the reality behind closed doors. He was at a loss for what to do. Already, his squad was bracing for the worst. They were considering plea agreements, ways to lessen the harm, and anything that would spare Jim from being imprisoned for the remainder of his life. However, Jim, he wasn't prepared to give up. Not yet, anyhow. The last treachery followed. Someone Jim had trusted like family, a former close colleague, went on record and consented to testify against him. Jim took the news like a kick to the belly. This was no ordinary individual seeking a plea bargain. This was an all-knowing individual. The announcement sent the industry into a frenzy. Other rap artists also contributed. Jim was supported by some who thought he was being set up. Others kept quiet because they were aware that hanging out with him may make them a target for the FBI as well. The most terrifying aspect, though, this was not the end of the government. Insiders said that the FBI had a list, an extensive list of names. Jim Jones was only the start. This exceeded everyone's expectations. And the most terrifying aspect, this was not the end of the case. Jim Jones' thoughts were racing as he sat by himself in his prison cell, gazing at the chilly concrete walls. Only a few weeks prior, he had been living the life that many could only imagine, traveling freely and making deals. The entire federal government was now bearing down on him, trapping him like an animal in a cage. The truth of his predicament had now struck in. His so-called pals were disappearing one by one, either making deals with the federal government or just separating themselves to protect their own reputations as the evidence against him grew. There was a lot of talk about loyalty in the rap game, but Jim saw how easily that commitment could go when the pressure mounted. The feds were unrelenting despite his defense team's valiant efforts to find weaknesses in the government's case. They weren't going to let him fall between the gaps because they had spent years constructing this case. And now that fresh proof was emerging, things were getting out of hand. The FBI's release of further surveillance film, clear, high-definition imagery that eliminated any possibility of conjecture, was the worst setback. The video showed Jim in a number of confidential encounters, whispering and making agreements that suddenly looked hard to justify. Previously, his attorneys could claim that the audio was distorted or that the wiretaps were imprecise. Now, though, this was not like the others. These voices weren't the only ones. These were images, indisputable evidence of his direct participation in actions he had denied for months. The internet took off. Fans' comments, speculations, and conversations erupted on social media, with many of them suddenly doubting everything they had previously believed about Jim Jones. Nevertheless, some backed him, saying it was a setup and that the government had been working against him for years. Even his staunchest fans, however, were unable to deny the growing evidence. It was now fact there in front of their eyes, rather than merely conjecture. Jim believed he had witnessed the worst, yet the nightmare persisted. Other important people who had been working in the background were being brought in by the FBI's increasing arrest rate. These weren't merely unknown individuals. They were well-known names that had earned respect in the field. They made brutal headlines. More arrests and federal stings show that Jim Jones wasn't working alone. The media was tearing apart every bit of information, scrutinizing every detail, and portraying Jim as the brains behind a vast criminal conspiracy. In a matter of days, his years-long reputation was being destroyed. His name had come to represent crime, dishonesty, and treachery. The atmosphere inside the prison walls was changing. The other prisoners had begun to view him differently. Since he was Jim Jones, a rap legend and a man who had established an empire, there had initially been admiration. Now, however, the respect was giving way to distrust as rumors of plea bargains and snitching were circulating. Being famous didn't affect the unwritten rules of the streets. Jim's prison life would become extremely risky if anyone had any reason to assume that he may become an informant. Every time he sat in the cafeteria or walked through the corridors, he could sense the tension. All eyes were on him, observing, anticipating, and attempting to predict his next action. He received an ultimatum from his legal team, which was his last and best chance to escape being imprisoned for the remainder of his life. His sentence would be drastically lowered as part of a plea agreement that the prosecution had offered. There was a catch, though. Jim had to cooperate if he wanted a chance at freedom. He had to testify, give over his identity, and assist the feds in establishing their case against more significant targets. The conventional tactic was to save yourself by flipping on the higher-ups. Jim, however, saw this as more than just a legal ruling. It was a matter of survival, honor, and legacy. He sat looking at the documents in front of him in the little, poorly lighted legal consulting room. His attorney explained everything. He might be out in 10 years or less if he accepted the bargain, and possibly sooner if he behaved well. He would most certainly die in prison if he refused. The numbers did not favor him. In federal prosecutions, the conviction rate was startling. The authorities nearly always got what they wanted once they set their sights on you. Jim had always taken great satisfaction in his ability to persevere and find a way out of dire circumstances. However, this was not like the others. This wasn't a dispute within the industry. This was neither a financial failure nor a label issue. The administration wasn't playing games at this federal jail. He reflected on his son, his family, and those who had relied on him for years. If he were permanently imprisoned, what would happen to them? Will they continue to support him, or will they leave him behind like so many others who have fallen before him? Then there was the flip side of everything. The streets, the industries, the unspoken laws that had ruled his existence. His reputation would be permanently damaged if he accepted this bargain and participated. People would view him as a snitch regardless of the justifications he offered. Furthermore, that stigma not only destroyed professions, but also took lives in this globe. He reflected on Tekashi 6ix9ine and the events of his story. Tekashi had complied, made a concession and left. But at what price? His credibility had been ruined, and his reputation was in ruins. Even while he continued to create songs and receive views, he would never again be respected. Is that something Jim could tolerate? Could he exchange his freedom for his honor? His stomach turned at the thought. The deal's expiration date was approaching. His attorneys informed him that he was running out of time to make a decision. If he didn't accept the bargain now, it might not be available later because the feds were pressing hard and moving quickly. He had to make a decision. He had never experienced such strain until that night, as he lay on his prison cot and stared up at the ceiling. Making moves and staying ahead of the game had been his life's work. Now, however, he felt really stuck for the first time. Regardless of his choice, he was losing something. He would have lost his legacy and reputation if he accepted the bargain. He would lose his future and freedom if he didn't comply. He was escorted to another meeting with his legal team by the guards the following morning. His thoughts continued to race as he moved down the corridor. Supporters were standing by. The business waited. The federal agents were in anticipation. Jim Jones, too. The most important choice of his life was about to be made. What would he pick, though? Was he going to accept the offer and betray the people he had once considered his family? Alternatively, was he prepared to fight to the finish, even if it meant receiving a life sentence? Whatever he chose, there was no doubt that his narrative was far from over. The future of Jim Jones is now in doubt. The issue still stands. Will he accept the bargain, or will he risk everything to keep his reputation intact as the FBI tightens their hold? More information comes to light, and his inner circle disintegrates. Fans are split, the industry is attentively observing, and the hip-hop world is rocked. Jim Jones would never violate the street code, according to some, while others contend that he has little choice but to flip and cooperate. But let's face it, the feds don't lose cases easily, and we've seen influential people fail before. Jim may be in for a harsher destiny than anyone could have predicted if they had further proof. In your opinion, what will occur next? Will Jim accept the offer, or will he refuse to speak up and resist? Please share your opinions in the comment section below. Do you think this is just another government ploy, or do you think he was actually involved? This story is far from over, so be sure to subscribe, like, and enable notifications. We'll be providing you with exclusive updates on Jim Jones' case, the true nature of the FBI's probe, and the potential implications for hip-hop's future as more information becomes available. It's something you shouldn't miss, because this case is going to take an even more bizarre turn. Stay tuned, remain locked in, and we'll see you in the next update.